Thank you all for coming here. I'd like to thank Murari, as good looking as this one, except in the business school, which always has a lot more money than we poor subalterns who reside in departments of history and literature and so on. So this talk today is part of a project, which is a 4-book project. And I'm just going to very briefly mention the project and then tell you why I decided to speak on book 4 of the project. None of the books has been written. They're all being researched. There are portions of all 4 that have been written. And the project is called the Genocide and Hope Quartet. I'm an avid listener of classical music, and there are lots of quartets, and that's one of the reasons I thought of the quartet. But there is also the Buru Quartet, which is written by Pramodya Anantatur, an Indonesian writer, one of the most phenomenal works of 20th century literature. The subtitle of that project is Studies in the Architecture of Oppression and the Redemptive Possibilities of Nonviolence. So the 4 books in that project are all each named after a place. But the name of that place now transcends that place. By which I mean that that name of that place is now a metaphor, a metonym for something much larger. So those 4 books are very simply book 1, Dandi, which is why I'm Gujarat at the moment. I just came back from a trip to Dandi, Bardoli, Bharuch. And of course, I'm sure all of you are aware, even if you haven't gone there, that Dandi is the place on the sea that Gandhi marched to in 1930 and, in a manner of speaking, transformed modern history. Book 2 is Auschwitz, book 3 is Hiroshima, and book 4 is Robben Island. And I'm often asked, what is Robben Island? Right? So this talk is going to be on Robben Island, and it seems to me that it's particularly important that we think about this book in India for a number of reasons, because the talk is being given in India. And one of those reasons, of course, is that, you know, if you asked an average educated Indian, what do they know about South Africa? If they're among the very elite set, well, then they know about Tabletop Mountain in Cape Town and Kruger National Park safaris. And if they're well-read, they know about Nelson Mandela. In fact, my wife and I have a flat in Delhi. It's on Nelson Mandela Road. All right, Nelson Mandela. So I think that's the only person in the entire history of South Africa that any Indian has ever heard of, is Nelson Mandela, to the extent that anyone's ever heard of South Africa, really, in that connection. And I want to remind you of something, which is that it is Nelson Mandela who said, after he was released from prison, that you sent us Mohan and we sent back the Mahatma. Because let's not forget that Mohandas Gandhi spent 20 years in South Africa before he moved back to India in January 1915. And one of the things the talk will mention is the hugely disproportionate number of Indians, people of Indian origin, who were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. And that is quite uncharacteristic, because in most other parts of Africa, the Indians acquired a reputation, justly or unjustly, it's not my business to discuss at this point in time, but they acquired a reputation for being a little bit snobbish and racist. And there was relatively less contact with the African populations. That's not the case in South Africa at all. And it is also a posit that you should think of the fact that right now we are witnessing in real time for the last 2 years a genocide. that is taking place in Gaza. And it is to the credit of South Africa that it is the first country that brought a case against Israel in the International Court of Justice. Now, these are all reasons why I think it behooves us to really think about what Robben Island might mean and the history of Robben Island. It is also the case, as a scholar who's worked on nonviolence and global histories of nonviolence for 4 decades, and someone who also teaches on genocide, that I think that the scholarship on nonviolence and the scholarship on violence are 2 different worlds. People who study Auschwitz almost never study nonviolence. And people who study the Gandhian movement in India or study the civil rights movement in the United States or study the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, that's a little more complex case as we'll see momentarily, they almost never study the history of violence. So I think we have to study these dialectically. And that is what, of course, the 4-book project does as well. Why those 4 books? It's beyond the scope of my talk today. So I'm going to give you this is a brief overview, a brief history of European colonization of Robben Island. I'll tell you where it's located exactly. I'm going to show you some photographs of that, the incarceration on the island, and the history of offshore prisons, often major prisons for political prisoners in particular, not for common criminals, are offshore prisons. Think about the Andaman Islands Cellular Jail, would be the example that would be most well known to people in this country, right? And you can think of course, of Robben Island precisely in this context, and you can think of Alcatraz, right, which is in the United States. And then we're going to sort of, in the course of the talk, it's not like I'm going to systematically go through every point, but in the course of the talk, I'm going to have to offer some observations about the history of the ANC, because I think there is something very specific about the history of the ANC, the African National Congress. And here again, there's a little footnote. There'll be 30, 40 footnotes. Each of these can be developed into a thesis. And for those of you who are looking for thesis topics, you can think about that. So for example, I can tell you that almost every nationalist organization in Africa was modeled on the Indian National Congress. It's not a matter of pride with which one necessarily says that. I'm simply saying it as a matter of fact, as a matter of observation. The African National Congress, why is it called the African National Congress? There was a Natal Indian Congress which was founded by Mohandas Gandhi. That was the first political organization founded in Africa. You know, when you think about all the things that Gandhi achieved, and Gujarat is a place where it's important to say that because here they are determined to dig him into the ground. I'll be very blunt. You'll see I'm very blunt. I know exactly what I feel about what the Gujaratis have done to Mohandas Gandhi. Okay? And it's very important to understand the enormous sweep of his thinking, the capaciousness of his ideas, which are also a part of Robben Island, as I'm going to try to demonstrate, however remote that history might seem, right? But you can look at the Kenyan National Congress, again, modeled after the Indian National Congress, right? So the African National Congress, however, has a very particular history, one aspect of it which will be central to the argument, and I'm going to look at multi-racialism in South Africa's history by looking at the ANC and the PAC. The PA is the Pan-Africanist Congress, and then we're going to turn to Nelson Mandela, right, and what Mandela learned there. And we're going to look at the way in which Shakespeare began to flower on Robben Island, because yes, there is a story there, a wonderful story, and we're going to turn to the case of Ahmed Kathrada, who was a member of the first cabinet of Nelson Mandela. He's called Kathy with affection in South Africa. You can't write the history of Nelson Mandela in South Africa without writing the history of Kathy, of Kathrada, who is, again, a person of Indian origin who had been settled in South Africa. That's where he was born, right? And then we're going to move to the last part of the talk, where I want to look at prisons as sites of learning. And I want to suggest that Robben Island was transformed into a university. Right? What better place to think of that than a university where you are? Right? How it was transformed into a university, what are the possibilities of that kind of university, right? And I will move on in my concluding reflections to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was, as I'm going to suggest, Nelson Mandela's way of advancing the idea of nonviolence. So here's the island. And the background there, you see tabletop. And that's obviously Cape Town is there. The island is not very large. There's a ferry that goes there from Cape Town. It takes about 15, 20 minutes on the ferry. It is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. By the way, that's the other thing that Auschwitz is. And there's something odd if you think about it. What does it mean to call a place where 1 million people were killed a heritage site? Heritage is usually you want to claim, right? You claim a heritage. I mean, I'm assuming that we don't all want to claim a place that was responsible for sending 1 million people into the gas chambers as world heritage. But of course, the supposition is that we learn. My own view is that we don't, in fact. Let me get back to that cliche about reinventing the wheel. I think we're destined to reinvent the wheel. Every time I see something happening, and I've heard this slogan, never again, never again. Well, yes, it keeps on happening and again and again. You just look at what's happening in Gaza, and that gives us a very good instance of the futility of thinking about the fact that we have lessons to learn from history. I don't know how many books have been written with that title. Don't read a single one of them. That would be my advice to you, right? And here is again the island. Now the photograph is taken from the island itself. That was an aerial view, and there's Cape Town there in the background with Tabletop Mountain. Of course, it's called Tabletop because it's an absolutely flat top there if you ever get up there. So what's a backdrop to Robben Island, and how should we be thinking about it? I mean, my interest in it is not historical as such, but rather as a place that's a site of learning and education. I want to understand the experience of South African political dissidents, including Nelson Mandela, and I want to suggest it was a place where the idea of the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was seeded. That idea was actually seeded there. Now, it's interesting to think about the fact that the normative histories of prisons, you will agree with me, are written around deterrence, punishment. What is a prison for? You get confined there. The idea is that it acts as a deterrent, right? A place of confinement, often cruelty, social death, because you're cut off from everybody else. One of the things that has really struck me in many of the testimonies that I have read of ex-prisoners, they were asked, what is it that they missed the most? Because some people spent up to 25 years on this island. 25 years of their life was spent on this island. What did they miss the most? And a majority of them said what we miss the most was the laughter and sound of children's voices. Right? The laughter and sound of children's voices. It's just haunting when you think of, because that's what happens. That's why a prison is often social death. The idea of social death was first explored at some length by Orlando Patterson in his master work on slavery about 4 decades ago, where he described slavery as a form of social death, right? And most normative histories of prison are written around these ideas: punishment, deterrence, cruelty, social death, and so on. Non-violence and the prison taken together offer a very anomalous and almost unthinking possibility. And that's what we're going to venture towards, right? It is also possible, therefore, I'm going to suggest to you that it is possible to write about histories of prisons as universities as places of personal growth and as sites of experiment with truth and nonviolence. And this is apart from the history which has a very honorable kind of tradition, and that's the history of prison revolts. Revolts within prisons, resistance, of that kind. That's not the history that I'm looking at over here. Generally, in maximum security prisons which are offshore, you don't get a history of prison revolts. And one reason you don't is because, let's supposing you were successful in the revolt, what do? Where do you go? It's offshore. Right? You have to swim all the way. And of course, during the course of that swim, you're going to get apprehended. It's impossible to escape. That's the whole idea. And that's why one reason you don't actually get a history of prison revolts in offshore prisons very much, right? If you think about it, right? So what are some of the antecedents in thinking about prison and the idea of nonviolence? Is obviously Henry David Thoreau's famous essay on the duty of civil disobedience. We won't get into the whole politics of this essay, its relationship to Gandhi. There's a huge literature on that question alone. He spent only one night, by the way, in jail before he was released, because his fellow friend and philosopher friend, Ralph Waldo Emerson, bailed him out. Then there's Reverend James M. Lawson, who actually lived in the Los Angeles area, with whom I became very friendly over the years. He died in June 2024. He was the person who basically educated Martin Luther King in the use of Gandhi, right? So he was a major figure in the civil rights movement. He spent a prison term and describes the education he derived from the prison library. He found it to be a very productive time for him. And what's singular about Lawson is that he remained resolutely, firmly committed to nonviolence, to ahimsa, his entire life of 95 years. And we know, of course, most famously, that Gandhi spent several prison terms and used the time in prison to read, reflect, recuperate, and grow inwardly. We know that Nehru's principal books are written, in fact, actually, out of his years in prison. And one can mention, of course, the names of many other nationalist and anti-colonialist movements, as I have over here. Just think about Lumumba, Ho Chi Minh, Kenyatta, and of course, all the South African political prisoners. One notable exception is, of course, the American founding fathers, as they're called, of the United States. None of them spent any time in prison. And it might be interesting to think of the implications of that. What do you know about freedom if you don't know about it dialectically? We'll have to think about that, but that's another subject, right? Now, what is its history? So it's called Robben Island, 8 kilometers west of the mainland. It's 10 kilometers north of Cape Town, occupies an area of 13 square kilometers, discovered by the Dutch, was in 1488, was a refueling station for Portuguese and Dutch ships. Right, so I've given the history there. It was also used as a penal colony by the Dutch from the mid-17th century onwards. So, it's enough to know this much about the history of South Africa, that South Africa, the Union of South Africa was only formed in the early 1900s, okay, 1910. Before that, what you had was you had the Cape Province, and you had Transvaal, and you had Natal, okay, and you had why is it slipping my mind? The Orange Free State, right? So, and it was the Boers. The Boers are of Dutch ancestry, and the English, who would eventually compete for supremacy. So, if you're thinking about where do the Dutch come in, so there's a earlier history of the Dutch there. And as I said, it was used as a penal colony, but also used for political dissidents and political prisoners. So in what you might call the pre-modern period, right? Okay, and then later by the British after they annexed the Cape in 1806, right? The 1819 date is important simply because Makanda, who is an indigenous political dissident, he is sentenced to life imprisonment by the British. He tries to escape and drowns while escaping. Just reinforcing the point I made earlier that it's very difficult to escape from these kinds of prisons. And during World War II, it's fortified with cannon, and then we're going to see its modern history under the apartheid period. All right? So under the apartheid period, from 1960s until 1991, it's a maximum security prison. When we talk about 1991, we're basically beginning to talk about the end of the apartheid period. Remember that Mandela is going to become the first black person to preside over free black South Africa, right? Free South Africa, I should say, and becomes the first president after he's shortly after he's released. And then in 1996, so 1991 to 96, it is a medium security prison, and then after 96, its history is going to change because it's going to become essentially a tourist site. It's going to become a tourist site, and it's eventually going to be designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Some of the famous prisoners who were there, Ahmed Kathrada, Nelson Mandela, I'm going to talk about both of them. Mek Maraj, who's still alive, who was a critical player in the history of the ANC. Walter Sisulu, along with Oliver Tambo and Nelson Mandela, I mean, this is like the trinity, the three great figures of South African, ANC history. And Robert Sobukwe, about whom I'll say something momentarily, who was the president of the Pan-Africanist Congress and who actually spent a number of years on Robben Island in isolation. Now we'll have to understand that because if you're in Robben Island, you're already isolated from the rest of the world. And within Robben Island, there were two forms of isolation, right? And Robert Sobukwe is the person who was put into isolation within isolation within isolation. So you couldn't even see this man. And South Africa pioneered various forms of suppression which are quite distinct to South Africa. Two that are worth mentioning is that in South Africa in the apartheid period, it was illegal to publish the name of someone like Nelson Mandela. If a newspaper published his name, the publisher of that newspaper could be prosecuted. The mere mention. So the idea was you completely block him out, you eviscerate him. And in fact, for decades, the only pictures that were available of Nelson Mandela when he was in his 60s, the only pictures that were publicly available were of him as a strapping young man in his late 20s. Because no subsequent pictures were ever published. All right? And the second thing that was distinct to South Africa was banning. So they actually would issue a banning order. So Albert Luthuli, who was the president of the ANC and the first person from Africa to win the Nobel Prize for Peace, right? And there's a very interesting history of Luthuli's relationship to Mandela, which again I'll turn to momentarily later on, right? He was put under a banning order. And when you're put under a banning order, it's not quite the same as house arrest. You can leave the house, but there's a certain area and you're confined to that, and that's a banning order, and no one can visit you except with special permission, right? So they would release a person from jail and then put that person under a banning order. And that banning order could get extended indefinitely, sometimes for 2-3 decades. All right? So this is important when we're looking at the history of some of these major players. Let me now first show you what happens when you arrive at Robben Island. So you know what you're seeing in the foreground is a ferry, and that's the plankway there. You get off the plankway and then you turn right, and that takes you into the interior. And they have these three very large photographs where you can sort of see some fragments of the history of the island. This is a photograph which is of the political prisoners who were first brought to Robben Island in 1962. There is a very famous political trial which is called the Rivonia trial, and the Rivonia 7, which included Nelson Mandela and Ahmed Kathrada. They are going to be sentenced to life terms, right? And they're going to be sent off to Robben Island. They're going to come there in 1964. But this is if you look at this photograph, what you'll get a very good sense of is the impoverishment. Okay, I mean these are African political prisoners. This is not the elite of the ANC that we're speaking about, right? And at its height, Robben Island had 2,000 political prisoners. All political prisoners were male, no females. And all were colored. A white political dissident was never imprisoned in Robben Island. The wardens were all white. Right? So we have to understand the kind of racialism that is going to become a part of the history of this island. Because what, of course, the apartheid regime is doing is it's accentuating the racial divide. All right? It's accentuating the racial divide. And it's also necessary to add that there are going to be times when I'm going to say, when I say black, I mean literally black, but sometimes that word black in South Africa is going to be used to include coloreds and Indians. So just so that you have a full understanding of how the racial scheme was in South Africa, what you have is you have four-tiered racial divide. Right? So at the bottom is people who are black. What the apartheid government called Bantu. They call them Bantu, and that is why the homelands that they set up for them are called Bantustans. Right? You know, what Israel is proposing to do to the Palestinians, right, including the two-state solution, would do exactly that. It would create a Bantustan for the Palestinians. Right? A Bantustan. And this is a homeland which you get a small wretched piece of land, usually the worst piece of land, totally infertile, and you throw these people in there. And you say you've given them a homeland, they have self-determination now. That was what the apartheid regime proposed to do in South Africa. And that's one reason why South African political activists are saying what's happening in Gaza is pure apartheid. We recognize it. We've seen it before. You know, right? Now, these political prisoners are belonging to the lower working class. The photograph that you see over here, all right? And so it tells you first prisoners arriving in Robben Island in 1962. That's the board there. This is, by the way, a photograph that I've taken on a recent visit, and you can see the barbed wire. One of the very interesting ways to think about the modern world is to think about the semiotics of some objects, such as barbed wire, right? You know, how is barbed wire used? What does it signify? What are the various places that you've seen barbed wire? And you almost invariably will come to the conclusion when you see barbed wire, there's something menacing about this, all right? So when did it first begin to be used? Almost certainly in South Africa during the Boer War. During the Boer War, okay? Which is 1898, 1902. Right? And then here, this is one of the courtyards, many courtyards in which the prisoners would be allowed to come out. So usually you could come out for 1 hour a day. And in the next photograph, what you see here is an interpretation by me of some of the things that were happening on Robben Island. So here I'm not going to be able to get into the entire metaphysics of nakedness, because there is a metaphysics of nakedness. You think about Auschwitz, right? And you know, when these camps were liberated, and when they were liberated by either the Red Army of the Soviet Union, or by the British Army, or by the US Army, depending on which concentration camp you're looking at. Each of these armies, liberating armies, had official photographers attached to them. And one of the most shocking things you see in that original footage is you see photographs of people, both alive and dead, completely naked, completely, not a stitch of clothing. Men lined up, women lined up, completely stark naked. That's how they were kept. Now, one of the rituals at Robben Island, right, was stripping on arrival. So when you were brought to Robben Island, the first thing they did was they had you take off all your clothes. Of course, they had an argument. The argument was, we want to make sure you're not disguising, you know, weapons, a knife, this or that. But frankly, that argument carries no merit, because if you read the memoirs of prisoners and the testimonies, we know that in fact they would randomly conduct these searches, and the first thing that they would do when they randomly conducted a search, they would say, strip, naked. All right? So I won't read out the quote, it's there for you to read. And it tells you how the prisoners experienced it, right? Because there are ways in which nakedness can be empowering. This is, of course, the opposite. A Jain monk may go around completely naked. That's a very different form of nakedness. Mohandas Gandhi went around practically naked. Practically. Yes, he had a loincloth, that was it. But he could go see the king emperor with a loincloth, or the viceroy, right? So as I've suggested, there is a metaphysics of nakedness which we can think about, and what are the circumstances under which we can actually deploy nakedness for certain political ends, and how it can be deployed for other political ends. And what you're seeing here is nakedness as the ultimate form of degradation. And a lot of the accounts coincide in telling us one particular fact, which is that often when they were stripped naked, so let's say there are 100 prisoners, 3 a.m. the warden comes and says, get up, get up. And they're sleeping, and they're all taken out of their jail cell, and they're then asked to strip naked. Then their clothes are thrown in the middle of this room, and then a minute later they say, make a scramble and get whatever you can. So somebody gets a pair of trousers, you know, that is too short for him. For someone it's too long. Someone gets a shirt that's twice the size of the shirt that he needs, right? Mismatch. So then you think about the metaphor of mismatch, because it's a way of breaking down identity, right? So what's happening there, I'm saying to you, is something with deliberation. These are extreme forms of cruelty and degradation that we're talking about. And in fact, there is a way in which nudity was being performed. So one of the things the prisoners would have to do is that after they had been stripped naked, then they would have to do a dance, and then the dance required a contortion where the prisoner would have to stand in a posture where his rectum is facing the warden, on the supposition that, maybe you're hiding something in your rectum. It was called the tausa. It takes its name from an indigenous dance form which has been perverted here. right? So there's a different form of the perversion of an indigenous tradition. And this is what Indris Naidu, one of many Indians, I have to tell you, a disproportionate number of the political prisoners at Robben Island and a disproportionate number of the political activists involved in the ANC and in its armed wing, the Umkhonto we Sizwe, were Indian. So a lot of the memoirs we have are also by Indians. I mean, they're not the only ones who left behind it, but it also happens to be the case that Indians had higher levels of literacy, even in South Africa. All right, so let me ask you, Murari, how much time do we have? Because I might have to omit some things. I know we started about 4:15, something like that, so 15. So I think we'll have to omit some of these, some of the things I wanted to talk about. This, by the way, on the left is Nelson Mandela, and on the right is Walter Sisulu. This is one of only 2 known photographs from their 20 plus years on Robben Island, right? No other photographs that we know of Nelson Mandela. And this is actually not the quarry, but this is where stone has been brought and what these people are doing. And, you know, the ANC leadership was like the leadership of the Indian National Congress. You know what most of the major leaders of the Indian National Congress were credentialed in? Law. They were lawyers. Sardar Patel was a lawyer. Jawaharlal Nehru, Mohandas Gandhi, they're all trained as lawyers. Same thing with the ANC. Huge number of people trained in the law. And here you have all these people trained in the law, and you know what they're doing? They're sitting on the ground and they're breaking stone, because that was what they had to do for 10 hours a day. When you were confined to this maximum security prison. For 10 hours a day, that's what you did, right? You broke the stone. This slide is hard to read, there's too much light there, but basically what it says here, the manuscript of Nelson Mandela's biography, Long Walk to Freedom, was hidden in this garden. So Mandela wrote the manuscript on toilet paper, essentially, over a period of 2 decades, and portions of it was hidden here and there, and then eventually it was all hidden in this garden by Mac Maraj, who, as I said, was one of the principal people. He's still very much alive, involved in the struggle. And we have a little, so one of the things they've done here, because no, it's a World Heritage Site, so that means that you have to dress it up properly now, right? That's what it means. To plant a seed, watch it grow, to tend it and then harvest it offered a simple but enduring satisfaction. The sense of being the custodian of this small patch of earth offered a taste of freedom. So they put up these little quotes from these leaders who were imprisoned there all around the island. This is the prison portion of the complex where Nelson Mandela was imprisoned, and this is the cell where he was held. And of course, you know, we live in times of selfies and Instagram, so I think you can expect what the next slide will be, right? Is hordes of people going there into the cell, trying to take selfies, Instagram. You know, the idea of reverence is not part of our vocabulary anymore. We don't even understand what these things mean. You know, things like reverence. You know, what does that word mean, right? Because here you go, a bunch of Aussies, and so this picture actually got published in an Australian newspaper expressing outrage, which I was very surprised that in Australia they were expressing outrage because they specialize in doing these things. Prisoner resistance and hunger striking, we'll have to omit this particular history because this gets into the history of hunger striking at Robben Island, which Nelson Mandela didn't quite understand, right? And so now I'm going to also start to begin to offer a little critique. You know, my Indian friends in South Africa, they have long complained justly of what they call the Mandelaization of South Africa. Yeah, that the minute you go into South Africa, you start dreaming Nelson Mandela. And what South Africa is trying to do now is trying to move away from Nelson Mandela and the legacy of Nelson Mandela I have a very different view on this. My view is that there were some things that he didn't quite have a grip on. And one of the things he didn't quite have a grip on is that the world had flown by him. So when he came out of Robben Island, it led him to a series of political compromises which were, and more importantly, economic compromises, right, which were, I think, fatal. But nevertheless, he pioneered something which we're going to turn to towards the conclusion of my talk. So there is a history of hunger striking on Robben Island, and Mandela himself tells you in his autobiography that he was not quite sympathetic to the hunger striking, and then he was told by the political prisoners that Mohandas Gandhi has set an example and we should follow that example, right? So there's a quotation which follows. We'll have to omit this okay. So here's some slides which just show you the agitation over hunger striking, okay, the importance of food. So just as we have a metaphysics of nakedness, we have a metaphysics of hunger that we have to think about. Okay, so in the previous slide, what I have is a long quote, which is his antipathy to hunger striking, which he talks about in Long Walk to Freedom. I have a whole discussion of using in part the work of James Scott, how in some ways hunger striking became the weapons of the weak, at least on Robben Island, right? So now let me turn to the last part, that is Robben Island as a university, as a place of hope. Because how did this place, which existed to demonstrate the levels of degradation to which human beings can fall, how did this place become a place of hope, right? Now, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is, in my view, so there are two aspects to the story. One is the TRC, the other is the pedagogy. Let me start with the TRC. And what I'm going to say here is, roughly in 2-3 minutes, is a sort of a radically dissenting view from the dominant scholarship on the TRC. Okay? So, when apartheid came to an end, the question was, how do we deal with the question of race? The history of racialism. What do we do with white people? Should we evict them? Should we deprive them of their lands? Because, of course, you can imagine that in South Africa, the small white minority owned a disproportionate amount of the land, as they still do. Right? I mean, that's, you would understand that. I mean, the same thing happened in Algeria. Same thing happened in Kenya. Right? Disproportionate amount of the land. And so, Nelson Mandela's view was that we are a rainbow nation. So this idea goes back to the Freedom Charter, which was adopted in 1956, where the pledge was taken that South Africa would be a multi-racial nation. Now, when I said earlier on, I haven't forgotten, I said that there was something that was distinct about the ANC. That is what was distinct about the ANC. Unlike the other African national congresses. Think about what happened in Uganda, right? Black nationalists eventually took over. Indians were driven out, right? Think about what happened in a place like Rhodesia, right? So, multiracialism was integral to the history of the ANC. And you remember I said that there's a 4-tiered structure, blacks at the bottom, what the apartheid government called the Bantu people, Then you have the coloreds, and then you have the Indians, and then on the top layer, it's the whites. A minuscule portion of the population in comparison to the other three groups put together. Right? And the South African government made many attempts, particularly in the last desperate days before the end of apartheid, including the idea of a tricameral legislature. The tricameral legislature were, hey, they told the coloreds and Indians, we'll make you part of our set. That's the tricameral, whites, coloreds, and Indians. Huh? If the three of us can agree to keep the Bantu in his position, wouldn't you like to join us? The Indians didn't take the bait, to their credit. Right? But the important thing is this, that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission now was Mandela's way of thinking through not just what do we do in South Africa, it was his way of thinking through how do we write the next chapter in the history of nonviolence. See, that's the argument I'm trying to make. Because Mandela has a very sketchy and dodgy history with the question of nonviolence. And if in a capsule form, the problem is very simply this, that the ANC was committed to a history of nonviolence under Albert Luthuli, whose name I mentioned before. Mandela tells you that he came to the realization that nonviolence is not going to work in South Africa. He tells you that. He came to the realization it's not going to work, so he decided to found the armed wing of the ANC, which is known as the Umkhonto we Sizwe, or MK for short. And he tells you that Luthuli, he had Luthuli's approval. He didn't. I've done extensive research on that, as have some others. He didn't. Luthuli never approved of the renunciation of the policy of nonviolence. Right? But in some ways, Mandela still remained committed to it. Now, I think his long years in Robben Island made him reflect very deeply on how the idea of nonviolence can be advanced. It's a fundamental question for all of us who are interested in some kind of justice in the world. How do we tackle the problem of violence, which seems insuperably difficult to tackle, whether at the state level or in interpersonal relationships? So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a device whereby the idea was you invite all the oppressors to come and say exactly what they did. If you reveal exactly what you did, you'll be forgiven. A lot of black people, of course, didn't like that. They said, no, why should these whites get off scot-free? Why should they get off scot-free? Right? What is also interesting, and that is the democratic spirit that, in my view, they inherited from the long history of the Natal Indian Congress and Gandhi's work in South Africa, is they said violence was committed by our own people. So therefore, the ANC leadership will also have to come and say exactly what they did. Those of us who were involved in terrorist activities will have to confess. The TRC experience is amazing, I can tell you, because what the TRC did was for years, they went around all over South Africa. All over South Africa, and they would have these public hearings in which a killer would just say, I'm the one who planted the bomb on this bus that exploded and killed 10 children. Openly saying it. And sometimes, of course, the family of the victims is present there. Now, I don't think that we ever had a TRC like that. There is a history to Truth and Reconciliation Commissions elsewhere. But the South African TRC set the model for the TRC. But the more important thing I'm saying is, it actually was a way to think about how do we advance the idea of nonviolence. Yes, so Mohandas Gandhi came along, did something extraordinarily interesting, magical in a way. But then, what's the next chapter? Because had Gandhi been alive, he's part of, he was always thinking hermeneutically. So, for example, he was in favor of prohibition. I think today he would have said sugar is the biggest problem. I mean, Pepsi and Diet and Coke and all the sugar drinks together kill more people than alcohol. I think he would have been on a campaign against sugar. Sugar is the biggest killer in history. You just look at all the slaves who worked on the sugar plantations, and then you look at diabetes. I mean, in Guyana, 75% of the population has diabetes. 75%. Former sugar colony, because all the men do is drink rum all day long. Right? You have to think hermeneutically. It's like going through the hermeneutic machine. And what I'm saying here is that we have to think about the future of nonviolence. It's not just enough to think, this is the principles on which you run a nonviolent campaign, right? How do you run a nonviolent campaign when your opponent is sitting at a computer and drone is shot from 5,000 miles away by punching something on the computer? Who's the opponent? Right? We have to think about new chapters. And that's what the TRC is about. Now, the final thing here is this, Robben Island University. See, Robben Island, the principle there was, the ANC adopted a principle. No member of the ANC who is imprisoned is going to leave the island without being fully literate. Because over 50% of the people who arrived there were illiterate. And if you read the histories of how they transformed it, scores of prisoners completing their bachelor's degrees, advanced degrees, right? The prisoners, by the way, were far more educated than the wardens. Far more educated. So they're very interesting accounts of where towards the end of apartheid, the wardens come and sit before the prisoners and start taking lessons from them. Lots of accounts that we have of this happening, right? So they're rewriting the history of the prison. Analytically, what I'm going to argue, just give me 5 more minutes, okay, is they're going to re-territorialize the prison. But here, let's turn for a moment to Shakespeare on Robben Island. So my friend Ashwin Desai, South Africa's leading sociologist of Indian origin, wrote this book, okay? Reading Revolution, Shakespeare on Robben Island. You think to yourself, what is Shakespeare doing on Robben Island? They had a single volume of the collected works of William Shakespeare. All right? Now, there was censorship as well. Especially in the early years, it was very strict censorship. One of the things, we'll get back to this slide in a moment. You look at this here. This is Soni Venkata Ratnam. You see in the middle over here, okay? Complete works of Shakespeare. And what do you see here? You see images of the Hindu gods and goddesses. So took a calendar, tore one of the pictures from there and clothed William Shakespeare in the image of Hindu gods and goddesses. Our gods and goddesses are supreme in any case, so they envelop Shakespeare. Let's not doubt that, right? But what's fantastic about this is precisely this. The wardens were completely illiterate. So they look at these images on the outside and they say, you can read. Religious literature is permitted. And of course, some of you might be thinking to yourself, well, but Shakespeare is not very political either. Really? Have you read The Tempest? Have you read about Prospero and Caliban and the story of Prospero and Caliban? Shakespeare is completely political. If one reads him in a certain way. And so this Shakespeare circulated. It's priceless, this volume, because every prisoner then annotated it and said, these are my favorite quotes. Yeah? Mandela, Susulu, Kathrada, McMaraj, Billy, Nair, you name it. All of them annotated that single one volume of Shakespeare, right? And so Ashwin Desai, picked up on this and said, well, we have to think about the practices of reading. And how do the practices of reading create revolution? Right? So this is that book he wrote called Reading Revolution, Shakespeare on Robben Island, published in 2014. It's a book that is obviously a testament to the power of the written word, the power of storytelling, tells us something about the literature and the role it plays in keeping alive revolution, right? And the last there I mentioned, of course, right, the Tempest as an illustration of the kind of political reading of Shakespeare that these prisoners engaged in. Now, the education of Ahmed Kathrada is one amazing illustration of how Robben Island got transformed. So Kathrada is of Indian origin, born in South Africa, joined the Communist League at the age of 12 in 1941, enrolled as a student at Wits. Wits is in Johannesburg in 1950 for a BA when he was 21 years old. So he's quite a political character. And by the way, I found out when I went to the archives last year in South Africa that he actually visited Auschwitz. And so there's a different link here now, because then I have to think about how might that have impacted some of his thinking. Right? So he's convicted along with Mandela at the Rivonia trial in 1964, and they're all given a sentence of life imprisonment. He served 26 years, 3 months in prison, 18 years of which were at Robben Island, during which he earned 4 university degrees, which are mentioned over here. Okay? These 4 degrees that he earned on Robben Island through correspondence courses. And one of the things that he did was he kept these notebooks. This is an illustration of there are 10 such notebooks. There are thousands of quotations from the writings of people all over the world. Very ecumenical, So one of the quotations, of course, is from John Milton, which I have to read out, because Milton wrote in one of his works, "As good almost kill a man as kill a good book." Well, this is English from that period, right? So that killing a man is as good almost kill a man is as like killing a good book, and in reverse too. Who kills a man kills a reasonable creature, God's image, but he who destroys a good book kills reason itself, kills the image of God, as it were, in the eye. Many a man lives a burden to the earth, but a good book is the precious lifeblood of the master spirit. Right? See, in the prison, the book became the most revered object. There was a literal reverence for the book. And by the way, the book means a book. It doesn't mean your iPad. No. Because then we'd have to get to the whole politics of technology. Because that's the problem with teaching students. Tell them to read a book, and then they'll say, yeah, I've read it on my phone. Well, you haven't read a book, my friend. You've read something, but it's not a book. Okay? Right? So we'd have to think about what's transpiring here, right? Robben Island in that sense created this and this is Ahmed Kathrada. So at the end of apartheid, Nelson Mandela said to Kathy, his great friend, when a dignitary comes, would you please give them a tour of Robben Island, because Kathy knew it as well as anyone. And this is Barack Obama with his family on a visit to the Robben Island, and there you see Kathrada next to Obama over there. And just 2 more slides, because we're finishing up now here. How do we think about the future of Robben Island? We'll omit this, This question came up in 1930 first, then it comes up in 1995. In 1930, remember, this is before the official institution of apartheid, because racialism was present in South Africa for a very long period of time. But the apartheid as an official policy of state only got instituted in 1949. In 1949, right? And so in 1930, there was this question of what do we do with Robben Island? And there were various kinds of proposals: turn it into a tourist site, reformatory, home for orphans, etc., etc. And then, of course, at the end of apartheid, the same question came up again. And then eventually, of course, it became a World Heritage Site, right? Now, so here's the analytic concept. What then did the Robben Islanders achieve during their incarceration? I say that they offer us examples of education, resistance, the value of autodidacts, people who teach themselves, right? We don't learn everything at a university. There's a long history of people teaching themselves, autodidacts, which we should be attentive to, right? The perseverance of the human spirit in the face of adversity, etc. But we can also attempt to understand their achievement as a form of reclaiming a space as their own. See, this is a space which is meant to dominate them, conquer them. They have to now take that space and they have to, what I call, re-territorialize it. They have to transform that territory so it becomes an asset to them as human beings. That is what they sought to do, okay, in Robben Island. And that is what creates the possibilities of nonviolence, right, and gives us a hint into what is the poetics of space here, right? And this is, in the last slide, I raised some questions for people to think about, because, you know, we have to always have a critical account of things that we like. So, for example, we'd have to think about whether the ANC attempted to monopolize the history of Robben Island with respect to the history of the anti-apartheid struggle. And this is too complicated a point for people to understand, only because you'd have to know the history in substantive detail. So, for example, you'd have to know what was the role of the PAC. The PAC was the Pan-Africanist Congress. There were people from the Pan-Africanist Congress at Robben Island as well. And one of the things that the ANC did, take the analogy of India. One of the arguments that's been given is that the Congress attempted to monopolize the history of the freedom struggle. So the critics will say, well, what about the Hindustan Socialist Republican Army? Why doesn't that figure into the histories? Just as an analogy, right? This is, I think, what is crucial over here, okay? So these are the questions that I put forward here for you to think about. Thank you. Yeah.
Yes, I think, the hermeneutics of the term, the next chapter in our understanding of nonviolence, I'm sure, and in the end that you mentioned poetics of space, all the things resonate with many of us, and I'm sure there are many questions, and we have around 15-20 minutes to take 3-4 questions, and then we can continue interacting with Professor Lal outside over tea and coffee.
Pinaki Majumdar, I'm part of physics here. This is not a question about Robben Island. I take off from 2 comments you made in the passing. One was about what India has done to Gandhi, contemporary India has done to Gandhi, and 2, the ignorance of Indians regarding what happens in South Africa, what really is South Africa. So India became free 80 years back, South Africa free more recently, and each of these freedoms would have created a promise of sorts. And you've seen what India has done with that freedom, where we have ended up today. Where has South Africa ended up? So contemporary, because the kind of activism you saw in South Africa, taking a position in the ICJ on Israel, you can't imagine in India. you can't imagine organizing a protest against genocide in India. You'd be beaten up by the goons and imprisoned. So is this a larger sentiment in South African society, that there is a sense of solidarity, equality, which in some sense we have lost? So is the legacy of the anti-colonial struggle still alive in some manner in South Africa?
The brief answer is yes, absolutely. That's the brief answer.
Okay.
The legacy of anti-colonial struggle is very much. It's very much there because, not only because it's only 30 years, so it's fresh in the memory. I mean, in India now it's not fresh in the memory of anyone. And one could argue, by the way, that if you go back to the Nehruvian period or even post-Nehruvian, let's say until the 80s, the idea of the global south meant something. Today, frankly, I mean, there's BRICS, but that's very different than the kind of way in which people like Nehru and Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay were thinking about the global south. I mean, let's not forget that in the 1940s, in fact, why 40s, 1927, Nehru goes, this is 20 years before he elects. Nehru goes to Brussels for the first anti-imperialism congress of the nations of the South. 1927. Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay traveled all over Africa, wrote a book on Vietnam, went to China during the war. See, we have become, I'm going to be blunt about it, India is very insular. When I look at newspapers here, like the foreign events in the rest of the world take up one page at most in any major newspaper. That is not the case in South Africa. There is a much greater investment in South Africa. Now, partly there's another set of reasons, apart from what I've described. That has to do with what it means to be black. It's very difficult for us in India to fully comprehend that, because if you ask me, there is no race in the world that has been as maligned as black people. In South Africa, what struck me was the sheer lack of animus against the oppressor among all the people I spoke to, even the ones who were disgruntled about Mandela. I said, yeah, Mandela's TRC let the white man off the hook. Okay? And I said that myself, right? But there is no animus in that sense. Now, there's yet another set of reasons for that. One of the problems here is that we keep on looking back. Our utopias are always in the past. There's a whole complex set of reasons that we'd have to enter into. You look at the whole project in which we are involved in this country, trying to rewrite the past, writing out entire swaths of people from it. You know, when Saeed Naqvi wrote his book, on which I've done a talk as well, it's a play called The Muslim Vanishes. Well, literally, that's what's happening. I'm sorry to say. Okay? And this is part of the story of why India, the road we have taken has become very different than the road South Africa has taken thus far. But I can tell you this, I know that the dream of independence in South Africa has also soured. That is to say that one will have to think about whether what's happening in South Africa, you see, the kind of animus that has now come up in this country against the Congress. And I'm not here, we don't have to look at the history of the Congress and how the Congress of Gandhi and Nehru is obviously different than the Congress of people like Rahul and some of the other, riffraff. Let me use that phrase. I mean, most of them are riffraff. All the political parties basically riffraff, convicted criminals. We have to really think about the kind of people who enter into politics in this country. And this is not my data, by the way, this is official data. 50% of the politicians in this country have criminal records. That's just the data, frankly. I mean, there's something that has gone dramatically wrong here. Partly it has to do with this obsession with the past. Well, that's why all these projects of rewriting history, eviscerating entire periods, this is a full-scale onslaught that we're talking about. In South Africa, fortunately, the anti-colonial legacy is still not dead. I'm not saying it's necessarily alive and kicking in every sense, but I can tell you that the way they brought the case forward, and then you read the comments of the South African justices, not just involved in this case, but more broadly, they have taken a very principled stand, which for a country like South Africa, which is at best a middle-ranked power, is very difficult to do. I think that should answer your question.
Thank you, Professor, for this really enlightening talk. Two quick questions I had, if I could ask you to reflect on them. One is, as I was hearing you, I was thinking about this simultaneous punitive as well as pedagogic role of the prison, right? For which there is and of incarceration generally, for which there is, as we know, a long history. So what was it about Robben Island in particular that made it become a school, really, of sorts, and really a foundation of some kind of collective resistance thinking? So what transformation was enabled there? That was one quick question I had. And my second question was on the TRC, which is, of course, such a fascinating exercise. But even for something like the TRC to happen, there has to be like some, I guess, recognition of or consensus rather, on the idea of a foundational harm that has been done, you know, which, and how impossible it is to establish that, seems to establish that kind of thing in the Indian context. So if you could reflect on these two things. Thanks.
Well, okay. So the first question is, how is it possible that it became both a site that was punitive and a site full of pedagogic possibilities, right? Community. See, we have to think about the isolation of Robben Island. That's crucial. That's crucial. See, so how do communities form? Okay, what is the nature in which solidarity is created? What is the process through which solidarity is created? It's very interesting. If you read the interviews with the prisoners after they were released, okay, and I'm talking about in the work going on for 2-3 decades. Some are quite recent, some go back to 30 years, and some even go back to the time when Robben Island was still functioning as a maximum security prison. So Alexander Neville, for example, a gigantic figure, a colored man, by the way, neither white nor Indian nor black, colored man. He was the educator, a linguist, a very important figure in the history of South Africa. So he spent 10 years on Robben Island, but he got out in 1985. Okay, so Robben Island is still functioning. Mandela is still there. Okay, so if you read the interview, you know what does he say? He says that the most interesting thing about Robben Island was, and this view is seconded by almost everyone, that the prisoners who were released almost lamented the fact that they were being released. They almost lament. They say that, you know, now I'm homeless. Now I'm homeless. Because they've spent so many years there, and they have communicated only with men. Many of them also, by the way, they say that they began to form friendships with men, which were not, by the way, homosexual relationships. These were purely platonic. That is that, they say, for example, that now we men began to touch each other, which we would never have done before. Right? So, you see, and in Robben Island, visits were very rare, very rare. You know, in most other prisons, you get visits. So a political prisoner may be entitled to 6 visits a year, 8 visits a year, 10 years a visit. Robben Island, the only visits you really ever got were from the International Committee of the Red Cross. And that was because of international pressure, particularly after Mandela's case was taken up all over the world. Okay? And 1 or 2 other organizations, similar organizations. There were virtually no visits from family members, you see. So it created a very cohesive, closed community. And that, I think, is critical to the transformation of the punitive site to a pedagogic site. Okay? The second question you asked, just remind me of what exactly the...
It was on the conditions of possibility for the TRC.
For the TRC, yeah. Yeah, the foundational base. See, in South Africa, the foundational base was the notion, first of all, that this is going to be a multiracial society. Now, if you're going to create a multiracial society, you see, just as if I can give you an analogy for a moment, they'll come back to the TRC. You know, if you look at 99% of the commentary on Gaza from the so-called liberal side is, they say, two-state solution. I don't know any self-respecting Palestinian intellectual or activist who agrees with that. And I certainly don't. The alternative is not Bantustans or two-state solution or pure domination by Israel. No. There is only one road ahead if we're going to think about a humane future. And that is a binational state. That is what Edward Said advocated for his entire intellectual life, a binational state, a state that is both Israeli and Arab. And if anyone says that's unreal, well, you tell me what other solution has been real? It's the same argument that's always made against nonviolence. You know, people try nonviolence for 1 week and they say, "Yaar, nahi, kaam nahi kar raha." You keep on trying violence for years, and somehow we are content with that. You know, because you think something is being achieved. Now, this is related to the TRC foundational base. That TRC foundational base is twofold. One is the idea of a multiracial society. The other is the idea which all of us will need to cultivate. And that is the idea that freedom is indivisible. It's indivisible. Somebody there cannot be free if I'm not free. That's the only philosophical, ethical concept on which you can possibly work to produce humane futures. And in South Africa, I have to say, and this is again a minority view, but I have to say that I think the legacy of Gandhi is much longer lasting than anyone in South Africa even realized. Because Gandhi worked for 20 years there, and this is notwithstanding the fact, I'm aware of the critiques, that there were black people who were not involved in the struggle. That's one of the fundamental critiques. Although I have often asked, can you name a single black person or organization in Gandhi's time that came to Gandhi and said, include us in your struggle? You cannot. Not one black person or organization ever came to Gandhi and said, we want to be part of the struggle. And if he had struggled on their behalf, the argument would have been, how dare he thinks he can actually speak for us? Right? But that is really the answer to the question. Multiracialism and the notion that freedom is indivisible. And this is why I think the TRC actually was a fantastic idea about how to think of nonviolence and take it forward. Yeah? which, as I said, is a minority view, but that's the argument. Yeah.
So I think we have